An alternative is offered by a colleague of ours, Sean Gregg, who's been doing a lot of work in Latin America. And one of the things he draws our attention to, and in one of his papers he calls this, he says, you cannot eat human rights. And his point is that, of course, it's very important to be arguing for the human rights of disabled people, but for many people that he was working with, it was really just about living enough, working enough, having community enough to literally survive. And it seems within a lot of the disability studies literature that the focus becomes too much on the global north, Western European, North America, and does not take on board a lot of kind of ideas outside of those contexts. There's a danger in doing that because, as people like Robert McCrue and others have pointed out, if we look outside of the global north, we'll find some very interesting ideas around how we support disabled people. So a good colleague of ours, Hao Ki Ling, who's living and working in Malaysia, she's a social worker, and she tried to introduce the notion of individual person-centred planning with families in the jungles of Borneo. We had a project where, you can see we've got the short story here, we from Manchester had to go to Malaysia to find out from them about disability. They had to come to Manchester. Can you imagine how disappointing that would have been for them? So when we were in Malaysia, and one of the things she told us about this is she said is that social work didn't work within these particular community contexts. Because one of the premises was that she was trying to work was on individual one-to-one work. But whenever she invited a client, they turned up with 25 members from the community. So what she had to do was to think around, well, what would work? And I can't remember the Malaysian terms for this, but what she did is they used what she called indigenous knowledge to think about working with the group collectively. I mean, it's pretty obvious stuff around kind of, the notion of collective, perhaps something that disability studies people are not kind of in tune with enough. Okay, the other area I wanted to just talk a little bit more about was the relationship between the self and the other. Now, there's been lots of literature within disability studies about the social world, about culture, about politics, but perhaps there hasn't been enough talk about the mundane, the everyday, and the relational. And for the psychologists in the room, this will really connect with you. So Deb Marks, who is a psychoanalyst, has suggested that disabled people constitute a huge problem for non-disabled society because they disrupt the normative individual. She says this, the person that dribbles disrupts a culture that emphasises bodily control. An individual whose speech is difficult to understand is assumed to have a problem because they challenge a colonising stance of certainty about how we should speak. People who do not walk are understood as tragic because they do not embody the idealised mobility of the autonomous walker. So these kind of observations then about the self and the other raise a question. If you are disabled, what is the other that you're expected to be? And if we look at lots of literature around this, we can argue, and this is not just for disabled people by the way, this is for all of us, that the big other against which we're meant to judge ourselves is this. So this is the idealised other of society. That is, you are cognitively, socially and emotionally able and competent. You're biologically and psychologically stable, genetically sound and ontologically responsible. You're normal, you're sane, autonomous, self-sufficient, reasonable, law-abiding and economically viable. And surprise, surprise, it's easy to do these things if you're white, heterosexual, male, adult, living and shopping. Shopping's crucial. In towns, a global citizen of Western Europe and North America. So all these words are in these studies, you know, of heteronormativity, occidentalism, phallocentric society, and so on. All these studies that come from the social sciences remind us that the other, against which we're meant to judge ourselves, is often this fixed. So what does this mean then for disabled people? Or what does it mean for any of us really? Clearly, some of us will have a different relationship with the big other than other people. If you're a disabled millionaire, you're going to have a very different relationship with this than a poor disabled person. If you're a bloke, you're going to have a different relationship with this than if you're a woman. But one of the things that's it's looking at the notion of the self and other is to think about the problematics that creates for disabled selves. So if you are a person with the label of intellectual disability, not matching up to these idealised other, what does that mean for you? What kind of things could that lead to, not only for you but also for your family? And we know when we've been speaking to families of disabled children, one of the things that they struggle with most is the idea that their child does not fit the normative standard. In fact, one of the things that most upset me was that one of the findings was that disabled kids don't get invited to non-disabled kids' birthday parties. And I know it seems like a quite trite thing, but it just seems to kind of like, you know, be the tip of the iceberg, really. Why? Well, because the disabled kid's not normal. I mean, people use words like that. You know, they're not right is a nice Yorkshire way of saying disabled. Oh, it's not right here. So this idea of this interesting notion of right, because, well, what does that actually mean? So maybe then our focus, and this is kind of one of the things I wanted to promote here, really shouldn't be on disability at all. Maybe we shouldn't be talking about disability, but we should be talking about ableism. Because ableism, according to Kamari Campbell, shifts our attention from the conditions of disability to the standards, the norms, and those unconscious moments of ableism. That is, of, you know, living the ableist dream. And this is also from Kamari Campbell. She says, internalised ableism means that to emulate the norm, the disabled individual is required to embrace, indeed to assume, an identity other than their own. I am not implying that people have only one true or real sense. Indeed, identity formation is in a constant state of movement. But the desire to emulate the other establishes and maintains a wide gap between those who are loathed and that which is desired. And when people are so obsessed around the able, they can often ignore pretty obvious things in front of them. So Kennedy, for example, this is a report of a paediatrician who, on examining a child with, quote, hypnotonic spastic quadriplegia, found vaginal injuries, anal scars, and a sexually transmitted disease. And this paediatrician reported, quote, these symptoms could be due to an obscure psychological syndrome. Goodwin recalls the case of a paediatrician belatedly and reluctantly reporting 3 boys who were having sexual intercourse with their sister who had the label of learning difficulties. His excuse was, quote, isn't it better to say 3 normal boys than 1 retarded girl? Now, we could argue here that professional wisdom is being bound up with the ideals of alterity, that is, of the other, of the able other. Another example is the case of a counsellor's comments to a mother whose disabled son had been sexually abused. At least it didn't happen to one of your non-disabled children. So here we have examples of dominant ableism which we want to keep intact, and to the extent to which we're not prepared to look at the realities faced by those who do not match the ableist ideal. Now, and we know that in flagging up the ableist ideal, we're finding more and more labels with which to make sense of the opposite, the disabled. So here are some of my personal favourites I've collected recently. Apparently there's a new emerging label called neomentia. So it's like dementia, but nearly. Not right syndrome. This was actually from, I said you're making this up, this is a clinical psychologist. They said, no, they're playing around this not right syndrome. I think I've got that. Low self-esteemism. Low self-esteemism. And what is it? Oppositional defiance disorder. It's just kids arsing around, it used to be called. So the point here is that I'm not suggesting that these labels are you know, completely unhelpful, but the question for an ableist lens will be to suggest what are those labels serving. And the argument, according to people like Campbell and others, is that in diagnosing difference, we're ignoring the ways in which the idealised able is becoming more narrowly defined. And if you go back to this, let's be honest, it does sound a bit dull. You know, on a Friday night, I think, right, tonight we go out with friends, And I hope to, by the end of the evening, displayed that I'm cognitively, socially, emotionally able and competent, biologically and psychologically stable, sane, autonomous, self-sufficient. The reasonable bit will have to go out the window. It's Friday night, for God's sake. Yeah. So there's this notion of what are these kind of ideals that we're holding to. Okay, so I want to finish now. Hopefully leaving lots of space here for comments and questions around the possibilities or the dangers of disability studies. For some disability studies researchers, they mourn the passing of time and suggest that now what we're entering is a period where disability studies has been taken up by the academy, and its critical, radical moments have just been kind of poured into the dull academy, where theory is only important, research funding is more important than that, and academics' careers are important more than anything. So this idea here that for some disability studies academics and activists is that in it becoming more theoretical, disability studies has lost its cutting edge. Some would also argue that some of these ideas like cripping and ableism are becoming too wordy. They're becoming too theoretical. They're difficult to pin down, difficult to identify with, and difficult to mobilise around. But what I'd like to suggest is that perhaps disability studies now and in the future offers us an opportunity for thinking about our disability as possibility, as giving us new ways of thinking about our relationships with others. For example, do we need to think about independence anymore? Or can we talk about interdependence? Do we have to talk about professionals being the bastards that oppress disabled people? Or we talk about professionals as allies to disabled people and their lives? And, as I was saying earlier, perhaps what we need to be doing is spending a little less time focusing on the lives of disabled people and asking why, as a culture and society, we are so obsessed with ableist norms. And in this sense, to borrow from the writer Scott Lash, we could argue that disability studies then is a lifted out space, a platform through which to think through, act, resist, relate, communicate, engage with one another against the many forms of oppression and discrimination that so often do not speak singularly of disability, but also speak of gender, sexuality, nation, ethnicity, age and class. In this sense then, disability studies have not developed simply to capture the theoretical interests of academics, but have developed theories that might be in more concert with everyday lives. Thank you.
Would everybody like the lights on? The sun kind of tucked itself away on us there. Here we go. That's probably enough light. All right. So we'll open up the floor to questions. I never wear a watch, as my students all know. So what time do we have?
Course.
So are there any questions or comments? I'll give you a couple minutes to think. And then just pop your hand up when you're done. Okay, here we go.
Hi Dan, thanks a million for that. I'm just struck by the story of Kurt, and we spoke this morning about this whole notion of kind of emotional resilience, and how potentially he was so emotionally resilient in doing what he did to protect himself. I mean, if you kind of pathologize that here's a guy who's at high risk of bullying, he has his bag, etc. That one act saved him from, further abuse and bullying potentially, and I suppose that can so easily be reflected as a negative behaviour, whereas in fact what he did just, he was no longer bullied by that particular young chap. So.